"Try it out, if you really think you belong here." The words came out like a cruel joke. A dismissive challenge thrown at the woman they thought was just a humble janitor. But what happened next left the entire auditorium stunned into silence. Naomi Walker had spent 11 years quietly dusting the pianos at one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the United States. She had never touched the keys, never spoken of the gift she had buried deep inside her for all these years. No one knew her story. No one asked. No one believed that someone like her, a black woman in janitor's attire, could possibly belong on that stage. Until one humiliating moment forced her to sit at a broken-down, out-of-tune piano, abandoned in a corner, forgotten. And from the very first trembling note, raw yet genuine, the world began to change. This is the powerful true story of how a woman, once overlooked, stepped into the spotlight. Not with fame or credentials, but with soul, with truth, and with a sound profound enough to awaken a forgotten piano and an entire forgotten generation. The Boston Conservatory in the early morning was a completely different world, where time seemed to stand still amidst the tall windows, covered in mist. It was the only moment Naomi Walker felt truly at peace. The black woman, with deep-set eyes always holding a gentle sadness, silently pushed her cart filled with cleaning supplies down the deserted hallway. Her rough hands, worn from harsh chemicals, carefully polished every key, every corner of the gleaming piano she'd never dared to touch for playing. Naomi had been working as a janitor at this prestigious conservatory for 11 years, but no one knew her name. To them, she was simply an invisible shadow, a small and insignificant part of the lavish world of high art. No one ever stopped to ask her a simple question: "How are you today?" In their eyes, Naomi didn't exist. Until one cold winter morning, as she carefully cleaned a Steinway Model D, the crown jewel of the conservatory, Blake Arliston's mocking, contemptuous voice suddenly rang out from the doorway, like a knife cutting through the silence. "How do you even work like this? You've left a stain," Blake sneered, arrogantly lifting his chin, his cold blue eyes looking at Naomi with a challenge. His expensive navy blue suit, son of a financial magnate, only seemed to highlight his unabashed arrogance. Naomi gently turned around, trying to swallow the suffocating feeling in her chest. She followed the long, slender finger of Blake, pointing to a spot that had been cleaned so meticulously it bore no fingerprints. Though she knew there was no stain there, Naomi didn't say a word. She simply picked up her cloth and continued wiping as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Unbelievable," Blake sighed, his tone dripping with disdain, mixed with some perverse pleasure at her silence. "Someone like you could never understand the true value of this piano. I bet you can't even tell the difference between the sound of a Steinway and a cheap Yamaha, can you?" Those sharp, venomous words stabbed deep into Naomi's soul, awakening a long-buried pain she had concealed for years. But Naomi still restrained herself, not reacting, just standing there, continuing her work in silence. Her eyes now seemed like an ocean, calm on the surface, but beneath it, a storm was brewing. Blake stood for a few more seconds, seemingly disappointed by the lack of reaction from Naomi, before he turned and left with a self-satisfied stride, his leather shoes echoing through the hallway like a painful reminder of the social divide she would never be able to cross. When Blake's figure disappeared completely, Naomi slowly relaxed her hands, her breath trembling, her heart suffocating under the cruel words she had long become accustomed to, but never ceased to sting. She stood there, alone in the vast room, amidst the grandeur and coldness of a world where she would always remain an outsider. Naomi closed her eyes, trying to comfort herself by imagining a different world, a world where she could freely touch every key, where the music from her soul could resonate without having to bow to anyone. But then, she quickly pulled herself back to the present, put the cloth in her pocket, and silently pushed her cart out of the room. Her footsteps felt heavy, burdened with a deep sadness that no one else could understand. And so, Naomi continued her quiet life, silently working, silently enduring the disdain, silently holding tight to her dream of music in her heart, knowing that the world around her would always look at her with suspicion and contempt. But what Naomi didn't know was that fate was about to present her with a great challenge, a chance to change her life completely, where her silence would no longer be a symbol of weakness, but would become a power strong enough to make all those who had looked down on her tremble with shame. As Naomi Walker stepped out of the room where the silent confrontation with Blake had just occurred, she paused beneath the large glass dome of the East Hall. The early morning light filtered through the thick glass, casting soft, opaque patches of light on the tiled floor, resembling water stains spread across an old fabric. She looked down at her shadow, a quiet image in her faded gray janitor's uniform, still gripping the worn cloth she had been cleaning with. There are moments in life that cannot be explained with logic. They simply are. It's when the heart suddenly pulls you to a distant place, to a memory long thought buried. And now, as Naomi's shoulders still carried the cold echoes of Blake's arrogant voice, the past began to creep back in, like thin smoke drifting across a cold winter day. Savannah, Georgia, nearly 30 years ago. Naomi was a skinny little black girl, with wide eyes and hair twisted into unruly curls, tied with a faded fabric string. She lived with her mother in a small, damp apartment at the end of Riverside Street, where every night the sound of a train horn blended with the wind from the sea that blew through the windows, composing a melancholy tune for restless dreams. Her mother, Lucille Walker, was a strong woman, but time had worn her down. She worked nights as a waitress at an old jazz bar called the Blue Note, where the regulars were mostly poor laborers, long-haul truck drivers, or aging, wandering musicians. But no matter how harsh life was, Lucille nurtured in Naomi a world full of color, where music was the only thing that could make them forget hunger, overdue bills, and the nights when the rain leaked through the roof. Naomi had known about the piano since she was 7. Whenever her mother worked late, she would sneak into the bar once it was quiet. There, Curtis, an old jazz musician with wrinkled skin and warm eyes, would often sit for a while after folding his sheet music. He had no children, no wife, only a dark, upright piano and hundreds of ballads soaked in the scent of cigarettes. "Want to try, kid?" he would ask Naomi, his fingers gently strumming a few low notes, as if awakening the piano after a long, weary day. Naomi would nod, and for the first time her tiny fingers touched the keys, and the decaying world around her seemed to stand still. The fragile, awkward sound filled the air, but to Curtis, he saw something no one else could see. A soul that listened to the melody before even learning to name it. "You've got music in your blood," Curtis would say. "That's something no school can teach. People can learn to play, but not everyone plays with their heart." In the nights that followed, he began teaching Naomi how to harmonize, how to feel rhythm with her body, how to let the piano speak when words couldn't. Naomi was captivated, as if she had found the only light in her life, a path with no map, only her heart to guide her. But life was never easy for people like Naomi. When Naomi was 11, her mother began coughing up blood. The diagnosis was stage 3 lung cancer. In the months that followed, Curtis still came to the bar, but Naomi didn't show up. She stayed home, caring for her mother, changing bandages, making porridge, washing dishes and massaging her mother's swollen legs from chemotherapy. The piano became a luxury, a volunteer group came to offer Naomi piano lessons. They brought a small electronic keyboard and promised to teach her for free every week. But after 3 lessons, they stopped coming. "We understand, but without reliable transportation, we can't continue," they said. Naomi understood. When you're poor, you don't have the privilege to chase your dreams. Her mother passed away when Naomi was 13. She moved in with her aunt, a strict woman who believed music was frivolous. "If you want to play an instrument, play the mop first," she would snap when Naomi asked for some free time in the evening. And so, the days that followed passed like a song missing its melody. Naomi stopped dreaming about the stage, stopped thinking of recording studios or stage lights. She worked odd jobs, helping in the kitchen, washing dishes, cleaning houses, and later working as a janitor. But every time she passed a music store or heard a piano playing somewhere, her heart would tremble. Now, standing in the cold hall of the Boston Conservatory, Naomi could still hear the sound of that old upright piano in the Blue Note. Remember every whisper Curtis had said to her like a chant etched into her soul. "When the world is silent, let the music say what you can't." Naomi touched a scar on her wrist, a mark from years of lifting and cleaning without rest. Her fingers, once delicate on the piano keys, were now calloused and rough. But deep inside, those hands still remembered. They still had the power to tell the story of a child who once knew passion and sacrifice. In a deep corner of her mind, Naomi had never fully let go. She had simply buried the dream beneath the ashes of duty, poverty, and a society that had taught her, "Someone like you should only stand on the outside, cleaning the stage for others to shine." But music, that fiery essence, had never fully extinguished. It waited. And now, after Blake's contemptuous glance, the memories stirred. No longer just pain, but a fire that had smoldered too long, now slowly finding its way to burn bright again. Naomi tightened her fist, her gaze no longer clouded as it once was. Inside her, a familiar whisper echoed from her memory. "If you dare to believe you have worth, the whole world will have to listen." And this time, she would believe. Music is a strange thing. Even when buried, covered by the dust of time and the heavy years of life, it always finds its way back. And for Naomi Walker, music didn't return in a glamorous concert or a hall filled with sparkling lights. It returned on a quiet winter morning, when the conservatory was still in deep sleep, and only she, a piano, and the eternal silence of cold stone walls remained. Naomi sat alone at the grand piano she had polished thousands of times but had never dared to touch as an artist. Her breath was visible in the light streaming through the tall window. No one in the building, no footsteps from students, no calls from the administration, only her and the piano. She hadn't planned on playing, it was just her hands naturally resting on the keys. A single note rang out, soft like a whisper, then another, and as if the piano itself had grown tired of waiting for this hand all these years, it responded with quiet, gentle, sorrowful echoes. The sorrow of an unfinished childhood, of dreams unspoken. Naomi closed her eyes. She didn't know what she was playing. She only knew that each finger was telling the story of her life through sound. A song without structure, without the need for technical display, only soul and the scars of the past. A faint noise echoed from the far end of the hallway, followed by slow footsteps on the marble floor. Naomi startled, stopping her hands, standing up quickly, her heart pounding. She turned, bracing for a reprimand, or perhaps even a written warning, but it wasn't Blake. It wasn't Meredith. It wasn't Celeste Hanover. It was Jordan Ellis. He stood there, wearing a dark blue security uniform, his calm eyes and a soft smile making his face approachable. He raised both hands as if to reassure her, his voice gentle in the echoing space. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you, I just heard the music." Naomi quickly stepped back, instinctively wiping her hand across her crumpled gray uniform. I shouldn't be here," she stammered. "Shouldn't be?" Jordan tilted his head. "Why not?" She fell silent. The answer was in her eyes. "Because I'm a black janitor, not an artist. Because I don't belong here. Because everyone thinks that, and I've believed them for too long." Jordan didn't push. He walked closer to the piano, looking at it with respect. "You play very well," he said slowly. "Not everyone can make an old piano sing like that." Naomi hesitated. "I've never had formal lessons. I don't have a degree, no teacher, I just remember a few tunes from when I was little." "Some people study their whole lives and never play like you did this morning," Jordan said, sitting down on a nearby step and setting his radio aside. "Have you ever thought about trying to step on a real stage?" She let out a dry laugh. "Step on a stage? In this outfit? With these hands?" She raised both her hands, rough and calloused from chemicals and labor. "The Whitmore Invitational is happening this week. I heard they have a wild card spot," Jordan said casually, but his eyes never left her. "An opportunity for someone with no name, no records, just talent. You could try." Naomi shook her head immediately. "I can't. They'll laugh. I don't have sheet music, no proper outfit. And if they ask where I studied, what would I say? That I learned from the piano of an old man at the bar where my mom worked." Jordan shrugged. "Sounds good to me. I think people need to hear stories like that more than boring bios." "You don't understand," Naomi whispered, her voice sinking. "You don't know how harsh this world is. I've lived in it, but I've never been allowed in." "You're wrong." Jordan lifted his face to look at her, his voice soft but firm. "I've worked here for 5 years. I've seen kids whose parents are music producers, entertainment lawyers, CEOs. They start piano at 3, with private tutors flying in from Vienna every summer. But I've never heard anyone play like you did this morning." Naomi turned away. Her eyes no longer held the same calm. "I have nothing to prove," she said. "Then you just need to play, not to prove anything, just to be heard." Jordan stood up, pulling a slightly crumpled form from his coat pocket. "This is the registration form. You can ignore it, but I think it would be a shame if this piano is only ever heard by me and a few mops." He turned and walked away, leaving Naomi alone with the piano, and a piece of paper resting on the piano lid, as pristine as a new birth certificate for herself. When Jordan disappeared around the corner, Naomi sat down on the bench. Her hands trembled slightly. She didn't touch the keys. She only stared at the registration form, which, to her, seemed like a call from the deepest place in her memories, where the little Naomi once dreamed a dream full of music. Inside her, a very real fear gripped her. A fear that if she dared to step into the light, the world would drown her in judgment. But deep within that fear was a spark that if she didn't do this now, she might never forgive herself for the rest of her life. Naomi sat silently by the piano as the morning light faded, and the sounds of the conservatory began to stir from the distance. The opening of doors, the hurried footsteps of students, and the murmur of conversations echoing through the stone hallways. She carefully tucked the registration form that Jordan had left her, as if it were a sacred object, fragile enough that even the lightest touch could dissolve the hope that had just sparked within her. All morning, Naomi worked in a daze. Her hands continued cleaning out of habit, but her mind never left her conversation with Jordan and the wild thought of auditioning. She remembered the evening spent sweeping the practice halls, eavesdropping on the sounds of pianos drifting out from behind closed doors. Schubert, Chopin, Rachmaninoff, played by people younger than her, whiter than her, wealthier, and prepared from the moment they were born. They wore polished leather shoes, sheet music printed on thick paper, and business cards from prestigious music professors. And Naomi, she had worn-out rubber shoes, a uniform stained with bleach, a piece of music never written down, existing only in her memory and her body, like a whispered story in the dark. She knew exactly what would await her if she walked into that audition room looking like this. Stares, snide laughter, whispered words full of pity, or worse, contempt. And worst of all, if they didn't laugh, didn't speak, didn't stare, if they simply acted like she didn't exist. That was the thing she feared most, invisibility. Naomi didn't have lunch. She skipped the meal, only drinking a glass of water before quietly leaving the conservatory. When she entered her small apartment in Dorchester, the silence seemed to be waiting for an answer from her. She set her bag down, hung up her coat, and sat at the kitchen table, a place that, for years, had only been used for checking bills and writing down grocery lists. The Whitmore competition pamphlet was wedged between the electricity bill and a pizza coupon. Naomi pulled it out, gently stroking the glossy paper, as if its luxury only made her feel more alienated. The images of previous contestants, young, confident faces, eyes shining as though they were born to stand on a pedestal of glory, tightened her stomach. She knew some of the names in there. Preston Mitchell, the only son of the CEO of a Broadway theater chain in New York, was expected to win this year. Naomi had once cleaned his practice room, picked up his water bottle caps after practice, and heard him boast that he could play Chopin's Ballad No 1 Inch in the Dark with just 2 fingers. He was also the one who once made a mocking comment when he saw Naomi walk past the hall. "Careful, she might just sweep up all my notes too." Naomi had smiled lightly at the time, as she always did, a smile to hide the pain, to survive. Now, the prospect of facing him, not with a mop in hand but with a piano at the center of the spotlight, made her heart twist. But then, while all her reason tried to analyze, rationalize, deny, and warn, there was a very deep, very real part of her that whispered something else. If not now, then when? Naomi stood up, opened the cupboard under the sink, the place where she kept old tax files, vaccination records, and unused documents. She took out a pen, returned to the table, and spread the registration form in front of her. The first line, full name. She wrote, Naomi Walker. The next line, musical background. She hesitated for a long time, then wrote, self-taught from life. The last line, piece to be performed. She bit her lip, not Beethoven, not Debussy, not anything the judges would expect, just composition in C minor, untitled. That piece had no name, but it had a soul. And for the first time in many years, Naomi felt she didn't need anyone's permission to express that. She placed the pen down, her breath heavy as if she had just climbed a steep staircase. She folded the paper, placed it in an envelope, and set it beside the key for work the next day. That evening she didn't cook, didn't watch TV. She sat by the window, gazing at the streetlights, her heart as still as the surface of a lake after a storm. The next morning, Naomi dressed in her uniform, slung her crossbody bag over her shoulder, and left her apartment earlier than usual. When she arrived at the conservatory, she didn't head straight to the technical wing like she always did. Instead, she walked slowly toward the central hallway, where the registration table for the audition was set up. The auditorium had already started to buzz. Contestants in wool coats, silk scarves, carrying leather-bound sheet music, quietly chatted with each other in the familiar tones of the art elite. As Naomi approached, many eyes turned to her. Some raised eyebrows. A few looked at her uniform, then exchanged glances, but no one stopped her. The woman, sitting behind the desk, wearing a name tag that read Meredith Clark, Program Coordinator, looked at Naomi with mild surprise, but still politely. "How can I help you?" Naomi took out the envelope, opened it, and placed the form on the table. "I'd like to audition," she said, her voice not loud but firm like the background music rising from within herself. Meredith glanced at the form, then looked back at Naomi, as if still not believing that the paper had come from the woman standing in front of her. After a few seconds of silence, she nodded and added Naomi's name to the bottom of the list. "You'll be the last one today," Meredith said, her tone even, but her eyes lingered on Naomi's gray uniform. Naomi nodded. She didn't need to be favored. She just needed one opportunity. And for the first time in her life, she had truly demanded it. Naomi Walker stepped back from the registration desk, the small receipt resting firmly in her palm, her feet feeling like they were touching the cold, hard floor for the first time as someone entering the game. Not to clean the floors, but to place a small dot on the musical map where she had once been erased. She turned into the waiting area for contestants, where a few dozen young people had gathered, most dressed in black suits, white shirts, silk scarves, or elegant dresses. Sheet music, carefully encased in plastic, rested in their hands like symbols of power. No one needed to speak, but every gesture, glance, and quiet laugh made it clear that they knew they belonged here, and they knew exactly who didn't. As Naomi entered, a brief silence fell, as if someone had played an offbeat note in the orchestral flow. A few eyes turned. A blonde girl whispered something to the person sitting next to her. A young man in the distance slowly scanned Naomi from head to toe, as if evaluating the quality of an item that had somehow wandered into a high-end store. Naomi knew how she looked. The faded gray uniform, the industrial fabric, stiff, thick, rough, the collar worn out, stood out among the contestants, all dressed as if preparing for a gala. She didn't have glossy black shoes, only worn work shoes with slip-resistant rubber soles. In her hands, she didn't hold leather-bound sheet music. She had only her own hands, scarred by chemicals and hard labor. She chose an empty seat by the wall and sat down, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the slightly ajar door where the judges listened to each contestant's performance. No one spoke to her, not out of politeness, but because they didn't see it necessary. In a world where value is measured by pedigree, fame, and summer music courses in Vienna, Naomi had no credentials to exchange. Then Preston Mitchell walked in. He looked as if he had stepped out of a high-end perfume ad. Brown hair slicked back, a slim-fit black suit, a perfectly pressed white shirt, and shiny Italian leather shoes. In his right hand, he carried a thick sheet of music, bound in deep green velvet with gold lettering reading, Mitchell, Nocturnes and Fantasies, Volume 2. The way he moved, shoulders slightly turned, cold gaze, a smirk, made it clear, even to those who didn't know him, that he considered himself the center of the universe. Preston swept his gaze around the room, offering a friendly smile to a few girls near the entrance, then walked purposefully toward the row where Naomi sat. He didn't sit next to her but angled his seat in front of hers, turning toward her as though preparing for a short, comedic performance. "You've got the wrong room," he said, his voice light but laced with malice. "The staff meeting room is downstairs, at the end of the left hallway." Naomi didn't react. Preston continued, louder now, so everyone around could hear. "I was just kidding. Maybe you're here to clean up after our performance." A few quiet laughs echoed. A male contestant shrugged as if to say, "Just a joke." A girl checked her phone, but Naomi was sure she had just been snapped a photo. She didn't say anything. Her hands on her lap tightened, nails digging into her skin. But her eyes didn't look away. They locked directly on Preston, not angrily, not accusingly, but like a mirror reflecting the emptiness behind his glossy facade. Preston faltered for a moment, but his smile remained. "No worries. We can be flexible. If anyone needs to clean the stage after the dress rehearsal, I'll be happy to recommend you." Naomi took a deep breath. She didn't speak, but in her mind thousands of sounds echoed. Not words of rebuttal, but the sound of piano keys, rapid, choking, persistent like the footsteps she had taken her whole life. No one knew, but with every mocking word, Naomi didn't grow weaker. She quietly added another note to the music she was about to play. The jeers didn't break her. They stoked the fire inside her that had been burning silently for years. The door opened. A contestant stepped out, face flushed, eyes welling with tears. No one asked, only a few sympathetic glances. Then a female voice rang out over the microphone. "Preston Mitchell, please." Preston stood, brushing off his cuffs as if preparing to step onto a fashion runway. As he walked past Naomi, he paused, tilted his head, and whispered in a cold, steel-like tone, "Good luck with your jazz." And then he disappeared behind the door. Naomi closed her eyes. Her chest tightened, then released, like a bow being pulled to its limit. She had endured silence for 11 years. Now, the world had finally noticed her, but not with admiration, but with doubt, challenge, and contempt. Maybe that's why she needed to step onto the stage. Not to win, not to retaliate, but to be heard. And for the first time to make them, all of them, hear her for real. Naomi sat still like a quiet mountain as the audition room door opened again, and Preston Mitchell stepped out with a casual, almost arrogant demeanor. He adjusted his shirt collar, flicked his wristwatch as if he had just finished a performance at Carnegie Hall, and then flashed a half-smile, speaking loudly as he walked without anyone asking. "Doctor," Hanover said, "My phrasing shows a maturity rarely seen at 23. He tilted his head arrogantly, his eyes glancing at Naomi like a dismissive farewell. "Good luck with your jazz experiment." Naomi didn't respond, but her hand, resting on her lap, had stopped trembling. "Naomi Walker?" Meredith Clark's voice rang out from inside, clear, betraying a hint of surprise despite her professional tone. Naomi stood up. The room fell silent, as though it had become a forgotten chapel in time. Each step she took seemed to leave a deep impression on the floor. A few eyes followed her, like sharp thorns. Some waited for her to fall. Others simply wondered when this little joke would end. The door closed behind Naomi. The audition room was spacious, with a high-vaulted ceiling and lights shining down from above onto the glossy wooden stage. 3 judges sat behind a long table on a raised platform. In the center was Celeste Hanover, with neatly tied silver hair and a perfectly pressed cream-colored blazer. To her right, a man with thick glasses, his eyes as stern as a judge in a Royal Conservatory audition. To her left, a younger woman, scribbling notes with an inquisitive look. Naomi stood in the middle of the room. The light cast her long shadow on the floor, pulling the heavy weight of her past along with her. "You're Naomi Walker," Celeste said, her voice both sweet and sharp like the edge of a razor blade. "According to your file, you'll be performing an original piece?" "Yes," Naomi replied, her voice clear and steady, without a hint of trembling. "And your musical background?" Celeste asked. "Self-taught," Naomi answered, without making excuses or lowering her gaze. A wave of whispers passed through the room. Celeste lifted her eyes from the paper and looked at Naomi as if analyzing an unlabeled specimen, suspicious yet cautious. "Do you work at the conservatory?" she asked, her eyes gleaming as if she already knew the answer. "Yes, I work in the cleaning department," Naomi replied, slowly but clearly, like a deep note in a multi-tonal melody. This time, the whispers weren't whispers anymore. One of the judges raised an eyebrow. Celeste didn't speak for a few seconds, then set her pen down. "We usually prefer classical works," she said, "but we don't oppose experimentation if it offers something worth hearing." Naomi nodded lightly. She was about to walk toward the grand Steinway piano in the center of the stage. The same piano she had only ever touched with a cleaning cloth for the past 11 years. But Celeste's voice stopped her. "Wait," she said, her tone still soft, but there was an undercurrent of cold steel. "I'm afraid the Steinway has been specially tuned for the main performance." She turned to the assistant. "Do we have any other pianos?" The woman quickly glanced around the room, then pointed to the far corner. "There's an old upright, but it hasn't been tuned, and it's not on the list for use today." "Perfect," Celeste smiled, then turned back to Naomi. "Perhaps that one will be more suitable for an emotional performance." Naomi stood motionless. Those who had once been looked down upon would recognize the hidden sarcasm beneath the polished phraseology. The upright piano in the corner was made of weathered plywood. Its legs cracked, the surface scorched from cigarette burns and scarred by time. It wasn't an instrument. It was a blunt metaphor. You don't belong on this stage. Celeste tilted her head, her voice mocking but still challenging. "If you find it difficult, we can certainly consider ending your audition here." Naomi didn't speak. She simply turned, walking toward the old piano. Each step felt like walking on the broken tiles of years of prejudice. She sat down, her hands gently resting on the chipped keys. A pedal creaked. The wood cracked softly under the weight of her body. But she didn't mind. She closed her eyes and exhaled a long breath. There were no more eyes from Celeste, no more Preston, no more gray uniform, only Naomi, and the music flowing through her like blood, like a heartbeat. The first note rang out, muffled but enough to cut through the heavy atmosphere. No one laughed, no one sneered, and Celeste, though still maintaining her composed face, began to tilt her head slightly to the side, as if listening more closely. Naomi let her left hand guide the way with slow, deep chords, carrying the feeling of earth, of fire, of unspoken sorrow. Her right hand danced like the wind, weaving melodies both tender and powerful, as if she were speaking a language that could only be expressed through the piano. She didn't play to prove anything. She played to tell her story. Each note was a scar, a loss, a hope that had never been named. Despite playing on an old, worn-out piano, Naomi's music was anything but faint. It rang with the weight of a lifetime, and that no one could teach. Celeste slowly sat up straighter. Her lips tightened, her gaze no longer as confident as it had been at the beginning. For a moment, she glanced at the female judge beside her, who had stopped taking notes, her eyes wide, her breath slowing. Naomi kept playing, knowing that she was being tested in the most unfair way possible. But she understood, sometimes the most forgotten pianos make the most memorable sound. And today, she would make them, all of them, remember an old piano, and the woman who had once only been allowed to clean it. The sound from the old piano keys, instead of being jarring or fractured as Celeste Hanover might have expected, resonated with a quality almost impossible to define. It wasn't perfection, but it was truth. A truth so raw that it made one forget about tone and simply listen with the heart. Naomi Walker didn't try to make the piano sound better. She didn't fight its age. Instead, she allowed its sound to emerge exactly as it was, chipped, hushed, uneven in some places, slightly off pitch at times, but never off from the emotion. She played her own piece, a nameless composition, never written down, each melody fragment existing only in her memory and her body, as if her very being had etched it through the years of work, sleepless nights, and silently buried dreams. At first, a few people in the room remained wary. Celeste sat up straight, her hand lightly resting on the table, her gaze cold as though analyzing a freshman's technical faults. But in less than a minute, something in her eyes began to change, subtle, but enough for the person sitting next to her to notice. The piece began with slow, deep chords, like the footsteps of someone walking through life with patience. Each note heavy, carrying the breath of dark roads, where streetlights dim and the wind whistles through the thin coat of a janitor returning home at midnight. Naomi's right hand wove a jazz-inspired melody, not in an academic style, but with a soulful depth that made people stop and listen in silence. It wasn't music learned from textbooks, but music distilled from life. Music that those who live on high pedestals would never get a chance to touch. The young female judge, who had been diligently taking notes from the start, now set her pen down. She didn't know when she had stopped writing. She didn't know why her throat had become tight. Another minute passed, and the music continued. Then something shifted. Naomi changed key. With her left hand, she played a broken, dry rhythm, like the sound of a subway passing through the city in the dead of winter. Her right hand pushed the melody into a soaring, hanging interval, like a cry from a cliff face with no one to answer. It was loneliness, but not despair. It was pain, but not hopelessness. It was the voice of someone once silenced by prejudice, now finding their voice through sound. Celeste leaned forward slightly. Her hands stayed in place, but her gaze had shifted. No longer the look of someone evaluating quality, but the gaze of someone being moved. But Celeste was Celeste. She wouldn't let that show. Perhaps she should try something classical, she said softly to the colleague beside her, her tone like an attempt to maintain control. No, the young judge replied, her eyes still locked on Naomi. I think if she moved to Chopin, I'd stop listening. Naomi didn't hear the whispered exchanges. She kept playing, and by this point the music was no longer a performance. It was a confession. When it came to the end, Naomi didn't choose a blazing climax like many contestants often did. Instead, she let the music fade, soften, like the streetlights receding behind the bus window at night. One low note, then a long, gentle, sustaining note, like a breath after crying all the tears. And then, silence. A silence not born of indifference, but because no one dared to break that moment. Naomi sat still, her hands still resting on the keys. She didn't bow her head, she didn't smile. She was simply there, like someone who had finally returned to the place where she should never have been pushed out from. A round of applause erupted, soft from the back of the room, perhaps from the male judge with glasses. Then another person, and soon the entire room seemed to wake up. A few audience members stood. A young female student wiped tears from her eyes. Even the cameraman for the organizing committee forgot to turn off the camera. Someone muttered, "Oh my God," but Celeste Hanover remained seated. She didn't clap, she didn't smile, she didn't react, except for the way she tightly clasped her hands in front of her, as if trying to control something within herself. Naomi stood up. She didn't bow her head. She didn't need permission to leave that stage. For her, the performance wasn't to be measured by compliments. It was a truth that had just been set free. And when the truth is spoken, it doesn't need anyone's approval. She slowly walked toward the door, and as she passed Celeste, their eyes met for a brief second. Not with challenge, not with anger. Only one thing remained: silence. But not the silence of denial. The silence of someone breaking apart from within. Celeste turned her face away first. Naomi kept walking, and the door closed behind her, no longer a barrier but an opening for an entirely new chapter. The door closed behind Naomi, leaving an echo in the hall as if someone had placed a silent bell at the center of everyone's heart. But that silence didn't last long. On the judge's podium, Celeste Hanover tilted her head toward the assistant, subtly signaling her to stand, then herself gracefully descended the steps, the sound of her high heels tapping lightly on the wooden floor like a series of commands. Her gesture wasn't sudden or impulsive. On the contrary, it was carried out with the precise rhythm of someone accustomed to being listened to, respected, and above all, feared. When Celeste approached the old upright piano Naomi had just left, all eyes turned to her. The way she walked, the way she casually flicked a strand of silver hair back over her shoulder, the way her hand lightly touched the cracked wood, everything made it clear that she wasn't stepping down to perform. She was reclaiming the stage. "Perhaps," Celeste began, her voice even and sweet like sugar dissolving in hot water, to help the panel better visualize the level of technical skill required for a competition like Whitmore, "I'd like to present an excerpt." Naomi, still standing near the door, hesitated. Celeste didn't need anyone's permission. She sat down, adjusting her posture as if sitting before a Steinway in a concert hall in Vienna, not an old upright, then began to play Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9 No. 2, a deliberate choice. Each note rang out perfect and beautiful, but also cold, like a flawless layer of lacquer. Celeste played with perfect technique. Sharp fingers, delicate pedal work, precise phrasing. Each movement seemed rehearsed over thousands of hours, like the old piano itself had to defer to her. But what the room heard wasn't just music. It was a declaration of war through the piano keys. Naomi understood that from the very first notes. This wasn't a technical demonstration. It wasn't a sharing of knowledge. It was a test. A weapon wrapped in velvet, thrown to reclaim power. That which Celeste felt she had just lost because of a performance from a woman in a janitor's uniform. When the music ended, Celeste turned her head, not looking at the judges, but directly at Naomi, the woman still standing by the door, her back slightly stiff. She stood up without a word, then gently brushed off a little imaginary dust from her sleeve. "That's the level of control," Celeste said, as if concluding a master class. "Music, to endure, must be built on a foundation." Naomi didn't move, but in her eyes the old fire was rekindling, not out of pride, but because the truth was being distorted right before her eyes, and for the first time in her life she couldn't remain silent anymore. She walked back to the stage, heading straight for the piano that Celeste had just occupied. The room held its breath. The judges exchanged glances. But Naomi didn't ask for permission. She simply stood by the piano, her hand lightly resting on the lid as if asking it one final question. "Are you still willing to help me?" Then she sat down. No words, no promises, no preambles. And she began playing her own piece again, from the exact point where she had left off earlier. At first, some thought she might be playing a new piece, but no. Naomi didn't change the song, didn't change her style, didn't try to bend herself to fit the standards Celeste represented. She returned to her own music, continuing it as if no one had interrupted. And this time, the melody wasn't just a personal story, it became a manifesto. Her left hand struck harder, more decisively, like the footsteps of someone walking against the wind. Her right hand, instead of being gentle like before, became sharper, digging into dissonant intervals, creating a musical quality that was almost unpredictable, but not chaotic. She was turning imperfection into style. The melody intertwined complex jazz chords with the blues rhythms of the American South. A fusion of the Savannah bar nights, the whispered words of a dying mother, the wind blowing through the station, the voices of forgotten years, all wrapped in hands that refused to follow any form. For the first time, Celeste didn't know what to do. She couldn't interrupt. She couldn't correct. She couldn't signal. She couldn't reclaim control. Sitting in the judge's chair, Celeste was frozen, like a composer who had just heard their symphony distorted and reluctantly realized it was better than the original. When Naomi finished, she didn't look at Celeste. She stood up, gave a slight nod to the judges, a nod as if placing the final period on an undeniable reply. No one in the room dared to break that moment with words. And for the first time in the history of the auditions Celeste had presided over, she was the one who had no response. Naomi walked away, never looking back. And behind her, Celeste Hanover remained seated, her gaze frozen in an expression never before seen, when a wall of power begins to crack by a nameless piece of music from a woman who wasn't invited, but had forced the entire world to listen. Naomi didn't look back as she left the audition room. It wasn't out of pride, but because she knew that if she did, she would see Celeste Hanover, the most powerful woman in the conservatory world, sitting there, as cold as stone, but perhaps inside, a seismic shift had just been triggered. And Naomi understood. If she stopped, if she let emotions overpower her reason, she would once again let someone else take the moment that was rightfully hers. Outside in the hallway, everything remained as noisy as before, as if nothing had happened. Some contestants were reviewing their sheet music. Others were on the phone, checking in with family. But there was a subtle shift, so delicate it was almost imperceptible. Yet to Naomi it was as obvious as an offbeat note in a chord progression. No one mocked her anymore. No one looked at her as if she were the water bearer or the dust sweeper. Instead, there were quiet glances, a little hesitant. Not out of immediate respect, but because of the fear of something they couldn't quite explain. How could a woman with no formal music education, who didn't attend a conservatory, who didn't even know the proper names of classical works, make an entire panel of judges fall silent? The answer, of course, lay in the music Naomi had just created. But this world wasn't easy to trust anything that didn't come with a certification. That afternoon, after the audition concluded, the panel held an internal meeting. Contestants were asked to leave the hall and await the official results to be announced the next morning. Naomi didn't expect much. She had walked through too many slammed doors to dare hope for a miracle. But Jordan Ellis, always knowing when to appear at the most crucial moments, was waiting for her by the back gate of the conservatory. He didn't say anything at first, just handed her a cup of hot coffee, then quietly walked with her through the back courtyard. "You made them stop talking," he said softly, his eyes fixed on the cobblestones. "I've never seen Celeste Hanover stay quiet for so long after an audition." Naomi let out a soft laugh, not out of joy, but because she didn't know how to react to the feeling of finally making a force like Celeste step back. The next morning, the announcement was posted on the main bulletin board of the conservatory, as it was every year. But this time, students and faculty gathered unusually in large numbers, whispering, arguing, discussing. Right under the title Official Finalists for the Whitmore Invitational, 5 names were printed in bold, and at the very bottom, after the names of those from the most prestigious conservatories in the country, was Naomi Walker, wildcard selection. The conservatory was almost silent for a few seconds. Then the contradictory reactions began to rise like off-key notes in an incomplete melody. No way. A janitor. Is this a publicity stunt? Maybe the judges are experimenting with something. But in the eastern courtyard, where Jordan stood, he quietly pulled out his phone. A simple message. Congratulations. They've heard it now. Naomi didn't read the message right away. She was standing on the roof of the annex building, where she had often silently wiped the dust off the railings, gazing at the distant city. She held a copy of the results list, someone having slipped it into her hand, and she read her name over and over, as if afraid it might disappear at any moment. That afternoon, Celeste Hanover held a small press conference with the local arts media, a rare move for her during a competition still in progress. In front of the cameras, she was still Celeste, well-groomed, strict, composed. But when asked about the controversial decision of the panel, her face softened, and a subtle smile appeared. Whitmore always has a wild card spot to open up opportunities for undiscovered talent, she said, her eyes seeming to trace an invisible space between the reporters. And sometimes talent comes from places we don't expect. A reporter asked, Ms. Naomi Walker has no formal training. Do you think that will affect the quality of the finals? Celeste paused. Her gaze lowered, then she answered very slowly, each word seemingly weighed carefully. She made me rethink a lot of things. That was the closest Celeste could come to admitting she was wrong, without fully acknowledging it. But everyone understood, especially those who had witnessed the moment Celeste had left her seat at the judges' table the day before, trying to interrupt Naomi and failing. Still, in Celeste's mind, the storm hadn't yet stopped. She had seen many talents. She had trained, discovered, and discarded those who claimed to be prodigies. But Naomi Walker was unlike any of them. She had no structure, no standards, no plan. And because of that, she couldn't control her. That made Celeste both admire and doubt her. Admire, because few could make an entire room fall silent with music played on an old upright piano. Doubt, because she didn't know what Naomi would do next. And if there was one thing that frightened Celeste Hanover, it was a free artist, one who didn't need her approval to exist. Naomi didn't know any of this. She only knew that she was about to step onto the stage for the finals, a place where the lights would not just illuminate her fingers, but also the calluses on the hands that once held a broom, and the wounds that no one had ever seen. But this time, she wouldn't hide anything. She would let it all show, like a truthful piece of music without any gloss. And if anyone felt moved by it, that would no longer be her responsibility. She just needed to play. Naomi Walker had once thought that if her name were ever mentioned, it would likely be in the faint introduction of a colleague. She's the night shift worker in the East Building, very diligent. But no, now Naomi Walker's name was spreading across the internet at the speed of a storm, beyond the stone walls of the Boston Conservatory, beyond the prestigious Whitmore competition itself. It all started with a 3-minute video, grainy, slightly shaky, but capturing the moment Naomi played her nameless composition on the old upright piano during her audition. No one knew who filmed it. It could have been a student. It could have been a backstage staff member. But that didn't matter. Within 24 hours, the video had over 100,000 views, with the title, Janitor Shocks Conservatory with soulful piano performance, judges speechless. The internet didn't need to know where she came from. They only needed to feel it. And they felt it, her music reaching deep, like it was speaking the words of those who had been silenced for so long and could never put it into words. Comments flooded in. I cried when I heard her play, not because of the piece, but because I saw a part of lost youth in it. She doesn't need to play Chopin. She is her own music. How can I contact Naomi Walker? I want to invite her to TEDx this year. In just 3 days, Naomi received over 70 emails, interview invitations from NPR, CBS, The New York Times, The Guardian, and even a famous podcast about inspiring women. Art schools in Chicago, Dallas, even Berkeley sent letters inviting her to be a guest speaker or performer. A renowned music magazine called her the echo of truth in the age of technique. Everything came so fast that Naomi didn't even have time to understand what was happening. One late afternoon, Jordan Ellis met her in the back campus of the conservatory, where they had often silently sipped coffee by the ivy-covered wall. "Are you okay?" he asked. Naomi just looked down at her hands, her right hand trembling slightly. Not from the cold, but from the weight of public scrutiny now pressing on her like an unresolved cord. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. "I just played music. Now they expect me to be a symbol, to be a teacher, an artist, a guide, but I've never guided anyone. I'm not even sure I've been walking in the right direction." Jordan didn't answer right away. He knew Naomi wasn't speaking out of weakness. She was speaking with clarity. She understood very well that once people labeled her a phenomenon, they wouldn't just applaud, they would scrutinize. Meanwhile, in Celeste Hanover's office, the atmosphere was entirely different. She had received the critics' response report from the audition round. On paper, Naomi Walker was becoming the leading figure of a new wave. Music from real life. Music that didn't come from velvet or soundproof studios, but from kitchens, storage rooms, restrooms, the places no one would expect an artist to emerge from. Celeste looked at the list, then at Naomi's picture on an article with the bold headline, "The Janitor Who Wrote Her Own Symphony," and a strange feeling stirred within her, unease. Not because she envied her, but because she couldn't control this. A part of Celeste, raised on knowledge, discipline, and structure, couldn't accept the idea that someone without formal training would become the face of contemporary art. But another part of her, the part she rarely showed, was forced to admit. Naomi had something that even after decades of teaching, Celeste herself couldn't create. And that made Celeste feel like she was standing at the edge of a great change, a change that didn't have her name in the headline. For Naomi, the following days passed like a stretched-out dream. In the mornings, she still worked. She still mopped the floors of the hall where she had performed. Despite the growing number of performance requests, she hadn't dared to quit her job, partly because she didn't trust her place in the new world, partly because she still felt safe in the repetition of her old work. In the afternoon, she practiced, not to please the judges, but to prepare for the finals. For the first time in her life, music was no longer just a place to hide. It was where she would stand up and say, "I am here." In the evenings, she replied to a few emails, ignored most. She declined some invitations that felt too unfamiliar. But there was one invitation she kept. An email from an 8th-grade girl in Detroit. "Ms. Naomi, I used to think black people couldn't play piano like white people, but I heard you play, and I want to learn. I don't have a piano, but I've started drawing the keys on paper and practicing along with your videos. Thank you for teaching me that." Naomi printed out the letter, taped it to her refrigerator door, right under an old photo of her mother. That Friday evening, the conservatory updated the list of honorary faculty. Under the heading, Artist in Residence, Special Appointment, was the name, Naomi Walker. And in the meeting room the next morning, Celeste Hanover, still in her white blazer, still adjusting her hair as usual, opened the session with the statement that left the entire panel stunned. We may not have created Naomi Walker, but our responsibility is not to silence her. It was the first time Celeste publicly defended Naomi, but those with a keen eye knew she hadn't relinquished power. She was just stepping back, preparing for a larger battle. Naomi didn't know any of this. She only knew that the finals were approaching. And this time, she wasn't playing music for herself anymore. She would play for those who had been overlooked, those who had been made invisible. She would play, not for admiration, but so they could never forget. On Monday afternoon, as the winter light began to bathe the cold stone walls of the conservatory in a golden hue, Naomi sat alone in the small practice room in the old building. The upright piano in the corner was the only one she felt no pressure to touch. It didn't demand, it didn't judge, it simply welcomed those who knew how to listen. The piece she was writing still had no name, and its structure was incomplete. But in each vague rhythm, in each tangled melody, Naomi could clearly feel one thing. She was still herself. Despite being pursued by the media, despite the hundreds of eyes placing expectations on her shoulders, every time she sat at the piano, she was still the girl from Savannah. Her fingers touching the keys not to perform, but because she couldn't not touch them. The door swung open, no knock, no warning. Naomi turned, and standing there in a high-necked black coat was Celeste Hanover. No smile, no greeting. She stepped in as though the room had always belonged to her. Naomi instinctively stood, not out of respect, but because Celeste's presence felt like an invisible power. Cold, still, imposing. "You've never trained formally," Celeste began, cutting straight to the point. Naomi nodded slightly. "You don't know how to build a climax. You don't control the pedal correctly, and your phrasing leans more towards emotion than logic." Naomi clenched her fists but didn't reply. She wasn't going to apologize for that. Celeste walked over to the upright piano, tapping 3 notes lightly, as if testing the sound. "I'm not obligated to do this," she continued. "But I don't want you going on stage with the mindset of someone who's been given special treatment. I want to see if you have the fortitude to stand alongside real artists." "I didn't ask for special treatment," Naomi replied, her voice calm and sure. Celeste looked at her, not harshly, but not gently either. Her gaze carried a weight of scrutiny, as if determining whether the woman before her could survive in a world where every note had to be accompanied by reputation and credentials. "Let's start with the opening rhythm of the piece you'll be playing in the finals. Have you finalized your composition?" Naomi nodded, her hand slightly trembling as she placed it on the keys. "I'm rewriting the middle section. There will be an irregular transition, blending blues and classical." Celeste raised an eyebrow. "Irregular?" "It has meaning," Naomi answered. "But it doesn't follow tradition." Celeste said nothing. She sat down on a chair against the wall, pulled a pencil from her coat pocket, and opened a thick notebook. "Good, play." Naomi took a deep breath and began. The first melody rang out, and the room seemed to shrink, focusing entirely on the sound of the piano. Celeste remained silent, but every movement of Naomi's hands, every press of the pedal, was observed with the sharpest eyes. When the music reached a strong transition, Naomi pulled her left hand back half a beat earlier than expected, creating an empty space, an emotional expression that Curtis, her old jazz teacher, had taught her. Let them hear the silence, not just the sound. Immediately, Celeste raised her hand. "Stop!" Naomi froze. "You can't break it there," Celeste said, her voice not loud but cutting. "The transition falls apart. Emotion must follow the flow. You're playing as if you're having a conversation with yourself. The stage is not a living room. The audience needs structure, not a personal journal." Naomi swallowed hard. She knew Celeste was right. Buy the book. But the book had never witnessed the nights she sat by the window of her boarding house, listening to the train horn echo through the dust and sweat. Those empty spaces, they weren't intentionally created. They were real cracks in life, and she simply didn't fill them. "To me," Naomi said slowly, "that silence is real. It's the breath between two pains." Celeste looked at her, not immediately rebutting. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote something in her notebook. "Then at least make it rhythmic," she said, like a small concession. "Emotion can't destroy logical rhythm." Naomi breathed a quiet sigh and began again. The session lasted nearly 2 hours. Celeste didn't hold back on her critiques. She adjusted Naomi's hand posture, suggested she regulate the pedal, even stopped her several times to ask her to start from the beginning. No praise, not a single nod. But when the session ended, Celeste stood up, closed her notebook, and simply said, "You made me stay until the end. That's rare." Naomi didn't know whether to smile or stay silent, but deep down she understood. That was the first acknowledgement from someone who had never bowed her head to anyone. Celeste walked out of the room, not promising to return. But Naomi knew. The final battle wouldn't be just with the other contestants. It would be with the very principles that were beginning to crack within someone like Celeste Hanover. And when she returned to the piano, placed her hands on the keys, something had changed. Not in technique, but in her heart. Her heart now no longer just wanted to play music. It had begun to understand what it meant to stand in the spotlight and never lower her head. On Monday evening, as the winter light began to turn the cold stone walls of the Boston Conservatory a golden hue, Naomi Walker stood backstage, her back lightly pressed against the cold wall behind the wings. In her hands, she held no sheet music, no score, only a small piece of paper with a few scribbled notes, a sketch of the melody she had just completed in the old practice room with a pencil, as the sun had set the evening before. Jordan Ellis stood beside her, silent as always. No words, no comforting gestures. Simply there, steadfast like an anchor in a swirling current. "Are you going to stick to the plan?" he asked softly. Naomi turned to him, her eyes shining with an unusual calm. "I'll improvise." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? This is Whitmore. No one has ever—" "Because no one has ever dared," Naomi interrupted with a smile. "I'm not here to win a trophy. I'm here to say what academic music has forgotten." Inside the auditorium, the host had just finished introducing the fifth contestant, Preston Mitchell, with a round of enthusiastic applause. Preston stepped out, his gait confident, as though he knew he had just delivered a flawless performance. He bowed to the audience, but as he passed the wings, his eyes caught Naomi's. He smirked. "Do you know who you're performing for?" Preston whispered. "Don't make a fool of yourself. This isn't a place for childhood emotional experiments." Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. The host's voice rang out again. "And now, please turn your attention to the final contestant of the evening, the first ever wildcard selection in Whitmore history, Naomi Walker." The initial applause wasn't loud, but then, from the back rows, a few people stood up, clapping more steadily. One person called out, "Brava!" Then another, and soon waves of applause spread forward like a slow, steady swell, growing louder and more heartfelt as it reached the front of the stage. Naomi stepped out. She wasn't wearing a ball gown. She wasn't adorned in sparkling jewelry. Just a simple black dress, her hair neatly tied back, and the old bracelet her mother had worn. The only thing she had brought with her from her old life into this historic moment. The Steinway Model D sat center stage, bathed in light from the high ceiling, like a torch waiting to be ignited. Naomi walked up, sat down, and placed her hands on the keys, gently, as if touching something sacred. The judges, 3 sitting high above, remained silent, their pens poised to take notes. In the center was Celeste Hanover, still with her usual impassive expression, but today her gaze wasn't as hard as usual. Something in her was waiting. Naomi didn't play immediately. She closed her eyes. And in what felt like a moment longer than an overture, she listened. Not to the sound of the audience, but to the voice in her head. The voice of her mother, of her late jazz teacher, of the footsteps down the silent halls over the past 11 years. Then she began. No sheet music, no pretense, no structure, just music, living in that moment, created from the pain and hope that blossomed at the same time. The first melody floated out, soft, almost whispered, like someone telling a dream forgotten for half a lifetime. But only a few beats later, the rhythm changed abruptly, quickly, forcefully. Her left hand plunged into dense, sorrowful blues chords, frantic as if running from something. Her right hand soared above, trying to escape the ground. Emotional riffs, free from rules, yet still following their own logic, the logic of the heart. The audience was stunned. Even Celeste leaned slightly forward. Her pen stopped midair. Naomi was improvising. Right there, at the Whitmore Finals. Something that had never happened before. She was speaking in a language no one had taught. One of those forgotten but not disappeared. She was telling the story of smoky summers in Savannah, of the music that echoed from the bar where her mother worked, of the nights with the wind howling through the dormitory window as she sat alone, sketching the piano keys with a pen on a wooden table. And then she shifted key. No one was prepared. A jazz segment entwined with classical tonality, a gospel rhythm cutting through the mournful tone, a series of unusual chords like the sound of a thunderstorm, like the cry of someone letting go of the past. But somehow, everything harmonized. Not because it was on the beat, but because it was on the heart. When Naomi hit the final note, a C sharp that fell into the absolute silence, it was as if the whole auditorium exploded in a moment no one dared to break. No one clapped, no one stood, everyone just sat in silence. Because something truly profound, truly human had been spoken, not with words but with music. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Then from the back of the auditorium someone began to clap. Another person stood up. And then everyone together, standing, clapping, crying, cheering. A storm of applause erupted, but it wasn't loud. It resonated like the wind through a forest, strong, vast, and real. The judges were still silent. Celeste placed her pen down, letting out a soft breath. Not out of disappointment, but because something had just fallen from her heart, the old structure. Naomi stood up. She didn't bow deeply, just a slight nod, her gaze sweeping across the auditorium, then stopping at the front row where Celeste sat. And for the first time, Celeste nodded back. Not big, not hurried, but enough for the whole world to know something had changed forever. Naomi walked off the stage. She didn't care about the result, because tonight she had won the most important thing, the silence that had once imprisoned her. When Naomi Walker stepped off the stage, the applause had not yet died down. It spread slowly, like the aftersound of a summer rainstorm, initially intense, then softening, but never ceasing. Backstage, the remaining contestants gathered, waiting for the final results. Some hadn't even finished putting away their sheet music, still loosely held in their hands. Preston Mitchell leaned against the gray stone wall, his face no longer bearing any trace of arrogance. He watched Naomi's figure disappear behind the wings, hands shoved in his pockets, saying nothing. It could have been shock or anger, or perhaps, for the first time in his life, he realized that greatness didn't always come from pedigree. It came from the pain that could turn into music. Naomi paid no attention to anyone's gaze. While the people around her were caught up in the chaos of backstage, she quietly stood in the corner of the room. Her hands relaxed, breathing steady, but her eyes drifting farther than the stage lights. Then, the door to the coordination room swung open. A staff member stepped in, holding a list printed in bold blue ink. Official results. Whitmore Invitational Finals. No one spoke. No one needed to. They all silently made their way back into the auditorium, where the lights had been turned back on, the stage bathed in a golden glow like dawn after a rainy night. Celeste Hanover was the first to step onto the podium. Her posture was still straight, her voice still as even as ever, but there was something audible in the change. A slight crack in the old porcelain. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her eyes scanning the room, where hundreds of faces waited. "Every year, the Whitmore competition seeks those who not only master technique, but also breathe soul into every key they touch. This year, we found something rarer than perfection." The room held its breath. Celeste paused for a moment, then spoke slowly. "This year's first prize in the Whitmore Invitational goes to Naomi Walker." No hesitation. No circling around it. No excuses. And then, the auditorium erupted like a firework bursting brightly in the black sky. Shouts, applause, uncontrollable sobs, all at once, as if the entire world, if only for this moment, had stopped judging and began listening for real. Naomi stood frozen. Jordan, sitting just behind the front row, stood up, his arms raised to the sky in disbelief. "You did it," he whispered, but with the volume of a declaration meant for the whole world. Naomi walked up to the stage amidst the prolonged applause. She didn't cry, she didn't shake. Just a faint smile. The smile of someone who had walked through nameless corridors, cleaned the dust others left behind, and was now standing on what had once been thought of as untouchable ground. Celeste stood waiting. She handed her the award plaque, engraved with Naomi's name in golden cursive, and then extended her hand. Naomi hesitated for a moment. Their eyes met, not like adversaries, but like two wounds recognizing each other. "Miss Walker," Celeste said, her voice softer, "I was wrong." A simple sentence. But from someone like Celeste Hanover, who had always refused to acknowledge anyone who hadn't walked through the doors of traditional academia, it wasn't just an apology, it was a surrender to the truth. Naomi took her hand. The handshake wasn't brief, it wasn't rushed. There was no forced awkwardness, no polite formalities, just a genuine recognition from someone who once represented the power of refusal, now bowing to the music that came from an unadorned heart. "Thank you," Naomi said quietly, but with eyes as steady as steel, "for daring to change." Back in the auditorium, the other contestants stepped out one by one. Preston stood off to the side, not clapping, but not leaving either. He watched Naomi like someone who had just witnessed something they couldn't understand, and knew they needed to start learning from scratch. After the award ceremony, Naomi left the stage, walking down the artist's exit for the first time, not the technical path she was familiar with. In her hand, she wasn't just holding an award, she was holding a turning point. In less than a year, from being considered the background to the main cast, she had become the one to rewrite the script for that very stage. That night, in her old apartment in Dorchester, Naomi didn't turn on the lights as she entered. She just stood for a moment by the window, looking at the darkness spreading under the feet of the high-rise buildings, and saw herself, for the first time, no longer belonging to the world outside. She walked over to the old piano, the one bought from a charity shop, with a few sticky keys and uneven legs. She sat down, not to perform, not to prove anything, just to remind herself, true music doesn't begin on the stage. It begins in the silence, when we listen to what the world has tried to suppress. Naomi placed her hands on the keys, and played as if it was the first time, and also the beginning of everything that was yet to come. The music that night in the small apartment in Dorchester was not a triumphant melody. It was a whisper. Software, silent, much like Naomi Walker had lived for many years. But now, in the very stillness, something had changed forever. Naomi was no longer the woman who put her dreams aside. She was the one who had risen from the ashes of those dreams through music. 3 months after her victory at the Whitmore Invitational, the Boston Conservatory held a special event to announce the expansion of their teaching program on boundless creativity. The first name to be introduced was Naomi Walker, artist in residence and faculty instructor for composition and personal expression. On her first morning stepping into the classroom as an instructor, the sky over Boston was a silvery gray, like the dust of the uniform she once wore. But this time, she did not enter through the back door. She didn't lower her head. She didn't avoid anyone's gaze. The faculty badge hanging on her chest now read, Naomi Walker, Faculty. There were over 30 students in the class, a mix of backgrounds, from international students to those who had just switched from engineering to music. They didn't just come to learn how to compose, they came to learn how to be truthful with themselves. Naomi didn't teach music theory in the traditional way. She started her first class with a simple question. Who among you has ever thought that your emotions are something no one wants to hear? Almost half of the class raised their hands. Naomi smiled. Then I will teach you how to turn silence into melody. News about her spread beyond the conservatory. Art schools in New York, San Francisco, and Detroit sent invitations for part-time teaching. Community music organizations, especially in low-income neighborhoods, called on her to be an inspiring ambassador. A major music publisher sent her a contract to release a collection of the pieces she had played. They named the collection From Silence to Symphony, the notes never written. But Naomi didn't stop there. She began organizing free workshops in the community, in places where art had once been a luxury, like an old church in Southside Chicago, a public library in Baltimore, or even in an abandoned basketball court in East Harlem. In each session, she didn't recount her Whitmore victory like a fairy tale. She spoke about the years spent cleaning floors while the music still played inside her. About the sleepless nights, not from practicing, but from worrying about paying her mother's hospital bills, about the fear that she would die, taking with her melodies no one had ever heard. And then she ended with a familiar phrase. Don't wait for someone to give you the right to speak. Play, even if the world isn't ready to listen. Naomi's presence at the conservatory also sparked a quiet yet powerful wave of change. students who had been hesitant to write music outside the theoretical framework began experimenting with jazz, R&B, and soul. Conservative professors, who had initially dismissed Naomi as a passing phenomenon, were gradually forced to sit up, listen, and hear the emotional recordings emerging from her classroom. Some of them, like Professor Broderick, who had once rejected students for lack of academic experience, now officially petitioned the board to revise the admissions policy to include candidates without traditional academic backgrounds. Celeste Hanover, after the fateful handshake with Naomi, still held the position of head of the department. But now she often appeared quietly at the back of Naomi's classroom, sitting still like a student, taking notes, watching every question Naomi asked the students. Once, after class, Celeste slowly walked over to her. "You play very strangely," she said, for the first time using a familiar tone. Naomi smiled. Strange is how the world defines what it doesn't understand. Celeste nodded gently, and for the first time her gaze no longer held the judgment of a critic. It was the gaze of someone, learning again from the beginning. On social media, Naomi became an icon mentioned in hundreds of posts, videos, and podcasts, but not as the award-winning black musician. Instead, with the nickname given to her by the community, the composer of the unheard. She received letters from single mothers, the formerly homeless elderly people who had never learned music, but were now pressing their first chords after watching her performance videos. There were letters from high school students in rural Texas, in the suburbs of Alabama, where an old piano was a treasure, and dreaming of standing on a stage was something no one dared to speak aloud. Naomi still lived in her old apartment in Dorchester, still kept the scratched wooden upright piano in the corner of her room. But now, when she sat down at it each night, music was no longer just a refuge. It was a path, wide and long, to take many others out of the darkness she had once walked through. She no longer feared the world not listening, because now she was the echo for all those who had been forced to remain silent. A year passed in the blink of an eye. But for Naomi Walker, every moment of that year was etched not in glory, but in hundreds of conversations, night trains, and the bright eyes in the crowd when they heard the music from someone who had once been considered invisible. And then, exactly 1 year after she silenced the Whitmore Auditorium with an untitled improvisation, Naomi returned to that place. This time not in a janitor's uniform, not with the wild card label, but as a guest artist, opening the ceremony for the most prestigious music competition in the United States. This year's Whitmore was not like the one before. From how they introduced the main program, everything had changed. The organizers kicked off the ceremony with a short documentary video showing students from various social classes and backgrounds, even those without traditional music training, but who were being educated in free expression, a model inspired by Naomi herself. On stage, a black and white photo of Naomi, taken as she bowed after last year's performance, appeared on the large screen with the caption, "From the custodian's silence, a new symphony was born." When the host's voice rang out, "We are honored to welcome the opening artist, Naomi Walker," the auditorium erupted in applause, no longer filled with curiosity, but with deep respect. Naomi stepped out, still with her hair neatly tied back, still with a calm expression, but now there was something different in her walk, the serenity of someone who had touched their true self. She sat at the Steinway piano, the one that had once been a symbol of distance, now a companion. Before placing her hands on the keys, she looked up at the audience, not to receive praise, but as if to remind them, "I am still me." The woman who once wiped the dust on the floors of this auditorium, but never wiped away the music in my heart. The piece she chose to play today was new. She wrote it on the bus ride from Detroit back to Boston, after working with a group of black students in a low-income neighborhood. It had no name on the program. No one knew the melody in advance. And just like a year ago, she improvised. Not to shock, but because, for Naomi, the truest things only came in the present moment. Not scripted, not planned, just emotion and presence. This time, the music began with a single note, long, resonant, like an echo from a far-off time. Then, slowly, the intervals intertwined, shattered, grew frantic, breathing with the essence of gospel, the rhythm of jazz, the emotions of the prayers her aunt used to sing in church. The auditorium was no longer a performance space. It had become a place of connection, where music was not just art, but a call from memory, from wounds yet to heal, and from dreams unspoken. And then, like a quiet stream, the music ended with a series of suspended chords. Not complete, but full of hope. Naomi stood up. She didn't bow like the other contestants, but like someone returning, not to seek recognition, but to make a way. The applause continued, undying. Many stood, some even cried. Celeste Hanover sat in the front row, her face showing visible emotion. For a brief moment she placed her hand over her chest, her gaze no longer that of a judge, but that of a student having just heard the greatest lesson of her life. After the performance, Naomi walked down the Whitmore hallway where her janitor's footsteps had once echoed 11 years ago. Each stone, each window frame, no longer felt cold. They had become witnesses, nodding at her as if saying, "We've seen it all." As she was about to leave the auditorium, a small voice called from behind, "Miss Naomi." Naomi turned. A young black girl, about 10 years old, with curly hair and a red coat, clutching a music notebook. Beside her stood her mother, a slender woman in her 30s, standing still, as if not daring to interrupt her daughter's moment. The little girl walked up to Naomi, her eyes wide and sparkling, her voice trembling but full of determination. I watched the video of you performing last year. My mom said you used to be a janitor like my grandma, but I see you as a star." Naomi knelt down to the girl's eye level. "What's your name?" "Annalise." The little girl smiled, then shyly opened the notebook. "This is the first piece I've written. I named it Bright Window, because it starts soft like the night, but gradually brightens like the morning in your video." Naomi opened the notebook and saw handwritten notes, crooked and immature, but full of soul. And she saw herself in those notes, the way she once sketched piano keys on the wooden table, with a piece of music no one wanted to hear, except the heart. She placed her hand on the page. "Can I ask you something?" Annalise whispered. "Is my writing good enough?" Naomi looked straight into her eyes. No hesitation. "You don't need to be good enough, Annalise. You just need to be yourself. And this piece has already done that." Annalise laughed, her smile lighting up the entire hallway. Naomi hugged the girl, then stood up, her eyes meeting the girl's mother, who was on the verge of tears. They didn't say anything but exchanged a look that only those who have lived through darkness can understand. That night, when Naomi returned to her apartment in Dorchester, she placed the sheet music of Bright Window next to the old upright piano. She sat down, opened the lid, and for the first time played someone else's music, the music of a 10-year-old girl who had just learned how to dream big. The sound of the piano was soft as the wind, but firm as the foundation, because now Naomi knew. She was no longer playing just for herself. She was playing for those who seemed to have no voice, to let them know that their voices could still echo. Naomi Walker had once been just a silent shadow in the halls of a prestigious conservatory. A nameless black janitor without status or recognition. But from the place that seemed the most small and invisible, she had written the symphony of resilience, courage, and truth. Naomi didn't just win a competition, she had awakened a generation, opening the path for voices once denied. And what about you? Have you ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or had to live quietly while your heart carried things never spoken? Share your story in the comments below, because who knows, your voice might inspire someone out there. If Naomi's journey has touched you, please like this video, share it with your loved ones, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories full of power and inspiration like this. Because sometimes it just takes one note from the heart to change the entire world.